an ethicist, Aaron Rabinowitz. He is the philosopher in residence for Rutgers Honors College. He has a couple, podcasts that he's going to tell us about. And one specifically is called Philosophers in Space. And it is all about this kind of thing. It's about philosophy and sci-fi and everything that's good and fun. So he's going to be this will make a lot of X-Men fans happy. Trust me. He's going to be arguing that since mutants already exist, we should probably try to make as many of them as possible. And I'll leave the actual argument to him. So Mitch, if you can push that button, please.
Hi, folks. Thank you all so much for coming to my virtual talk on the moral necessity of mutant accelerationism, an issue near and dear to my heart. My name is Aaron Rabinowitz. I am an ethics philosopher who has a particular interest in filling as much of my philosophy with as much pop culture as I possibly can. And I know that a lot of folks have recently been particularly interested in the issue of mutant accelerationism as events have unfolded in the House of X. So I'm going to talk about some of those issues and the moral arguments that I see playing out in the comics that I think are not quite necessarily the heel turn that some might be worried they are, though I could understand some of your concerns. So let's dive right in here with our first rule of Mutant Club, right? We need to make more mutants. This is a interesting imperative, the idea that we need more mutants in the world rather than just to protect the current mutants that exist. And, I can certainly understand some folks' concerns. It's put forward, of course, by folks like Nightcrawler in a somewhat religious kind of framing, in the sense of be fruitful, to replenish the earth and subdue it, with some little anxiety about what the word subdue there could potentially mean. In this context, it is, I think, unclear, at least initially, what Nightcrawler means in terms of making more mutants. Is it simply that we need to resurrect, using the new resurrection technology, mutants that have died, or is this a sort of we need to go forth and proliferate mutants exponentially or something like that? Whatever it is that he's arguing for, I'm personally going to argue here that I think we should be doing both. So I think it's really important that, if you're in a world in which mutants already exist, you have a strong moral imperative to create more mutants. Why is that the case? So first of all, there are several, I think, basic, fairly straightforward reasons. And I'll unpack these further with a sort of comparison to a real world situation that we are currently wrestling with in ethics. So first of all, mutants could easily solve, it seems like, most every problem that we as a species are dealing with. Not necessarily all the problems. There would still be interpersonal conflict, right? There would still be social stress and disagreement over foundational issues. But big problems, things like climate change, could be heavily addressed. And so I'll talk about that more as sort of a central, instrumental, utilitarian kind of consequentialist argument for why we ought to bring about more of these entities if possible. Another argument that's a little bit more aimed towards the well-being of mutants themselves, which should be, I think, at the center of our concern here, is, mutants off and on perennially are being targeted as subjects of oppression, as something to be feared and potentially exterminated. And I think there's a good case to be made that one of the easiest ways to protect a group from that kind of abuse is to have more people in that group, right? If mutants make up a tiny minority in society, it's much easier to isolate and marginalize them. But if they make up a large portion, perhaps let's say the majority of society, then they are no longer easy targets of oppression in this kind of way, which in turn can have sort of valuable knock-on effects in the degree to which mutants break bad, as it were. And then finally, right, mutants, just generally speaking, are way cooler than non-mutants. I think we could all agree. If you have an individual with versus without mutant powers, the one with mutant powers is always going to be more interesting. It's a kind of unique extra feature. It's why we write all these stories about them. It's why we're obsessed with them. It's why most of us, have given the role of the die of even mediocre mutant powers. Most of us would jump at the chance just because it would be sort of interesting and different and set you apart from all the other people who have all roughly the same kinds of abilities as everybody else. So, I mean, these are just kinds of, basic reasons that people have already brought mutants into the world in their own minds. And we would be then, I think, justified in bringing more into the world if we had the power to do so. Now, I think we see this sort of argument laid out fairly explicitly in the comics in a way that I think is broadly justifiable, though again, I understand the concerns about the way it is presented. So, for example, I will read here from, this is actually from the fandom wiki about the Omega Protocol. It says, while it is believed that a greater dynamo is possible through collective means, which is to say, more good can be done by group activity than the work of any one great person, quote unquote, right? It is a current priority for the mutant nation of Krakoa to protect and nurture its greatest natural resource, Omega level mutants. All efforts are to be expended in order to secure the future of the state. Now, setting aside, of course, the kind of creepy 14 words, a little bit neo-Nazi sounding part at the end there, right? I think this is ethically spot on. Omega level mutants are the most important resource that we could ever possibly imagine if they existed in the world. And we would be sort of maximally obligated to generate them and, preserve them and protect their well-being and such so that they could bring about all sorts of massive amounts of change. Just think about like your basic list of what Omega level mutants can do, what they can manipulate, right? We're talking about things like weather, magnetism, minds, power, matter itself, and like reality itself, right? You have these incredibly high level mutants who can literally reshape reality. These are game changing kinds of abilities that could, just have an incredibly, incalculable, you could say functionally infinite, right, upend of potential gain, like a potential good that they could produce. Now, that being said, right, I understand there are risks, right? And some people are going to be concerned about the risks of proliferation of individuals with all of these extreme kinds of powers. We can think, for example, of Legion, the Omega level mind mutant, who also has dissociative personality disorder and so struggles to maintain their reality and therefore struggles to not damage the reality around them. I'm not going to say that there aren't challenges, right? There are always going to definitely be challenges. The issue is, how do we address those challenges? And the answer, if you have a choice, especially in this situation where mutants already exist, right, where they are sort of unavoidable in this kind of sense, there just always are going to be these challenges. And if you try to suppress that reality, right, if you try to get rid of all mutants, you're just going to produce reality altering mutants who will stop you. That just seems to be inevitably the way that things will work out when you try to suppress these kinds of entities. So that being said, right, those are our risks, but we also have these great rewards. Now, broadly speaking, right, to put this colloquially, it takes, I think, a good mutant with reality warping abilities to stop a bad, quote unquote, bad mutant with reality warping abilities, right? We might not necessarily want to argue that someone like Legion is a bad mutant so much as just dealing with some issues. Now, I understand this slide may no longer be accurate, as apparently it's no longer the case that the Richards kid is actually a mutant, but you get the idea, right? That like, as you move towards these god level abilities, as you experience, various kinds of entities that can just reshape reality fundamentally, there's no chance that like normal individuals are going to deal with that, right? There's no way that they're going to address it. There's no way the military is going to address it or something like that. The only way you're going to deal with it is by there being enough different mutants who have the ability to keep other mutants in check in this kind of way. And these reality altering mutants, I think it's important to note, bring with them an even different kind of level of potential good, right? A weather changing mutant like Storm could potentially fix climate change, right? With no negative repercussions, right? You don't have to darken the sky or use geoengineering or something like that. She could in some way, restore balance and such. Now, of course, you would also have to do the work of bringing about societies that don't just break it again, right? But she could substantially counteract those impacts. But that's nothing, right, compared to an entity that has the ability to fundamentally reshape reality, including maybe fundamentally reshaping the past, right? You could, in theory, with one of these individuals, go back and alter colonialism, for example. And I think there's a good argument to be made that if you had the power to go back and prevent, the exploitation of Africa, for example, that there's a good reason to do so, not just that it would necessarily produce more Wakandas. But if you feel like, you'd be worried that in changing the past, you change the future, you erase certain people, that might be unethical, then, these reality altering mutants would present the absolute best chance for bringing about a more just and equitable present day and future, given the intransigence that we've seen in trying to bring about substantial social change through more traditional means. So I want to compare this, right? Because, at the end of the day, you can't do analysis of mutants and X-Men and whatnot without explaining, what current cultural trend are they meant to be sort of subtly representing here. And I won't say for sure this is what they're on about, but I think there's a fair comparison to be made between this idea of the creation of a bunch more mutants and discussions around AI ethics, specifically with regard to superintelligence. Right? I think it's correct to say that omega level mutants are basically the equivalent of a super intelligent AI in terms of their risk reward profiles, which is to say they have very high rewards and very high risks. Both, all other ways that I think the comparison lines up, right? Both can just fundamentally reshape or destroy everything, depending on how they are taught or raised or programmed. Both are likely to be ultimately outside of our control once they reach maturity, given their power levels relative to us. And both, I think, should ultimately be treated as persons with autonomy and the right to self-determination, if they exist in the world, right? So given all of those factors, right, what can we learn about AI and superintelligence from our mutants, and what can we learn about our mutants from AI and superintelligence? Here I'm going to draw heavily on a great book for folks who are interested by Nick Bostrom called Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies, where he talks about how we are essentially on the cusp of an AI takeoff where AI could, in theory, bootstrap its own intelligence up from the very high levels that we are developing with our AI currently to like levels that are orders of magnitude higher than us as human beings and would sort of produce these exceptionally impressive entities. And he basically, so he sort of argues that barring some kind of cataclysm, we are on track to produce, or, barring like we discover that fundamentally it's impossible in some weird way that we hadn't imagined, but if that's unlikely, we could say, in the next somewhere between 50 and 200 years, you could see this explosion of super intelligent AI. And that the major question at this point is, how fast does that takeoff happen, and how many super intelligences arise when it does? So he distinguishes between this idea of a unipolar takeoff and multipolar takeoff. So a unipolar would be like if one government in secret manages to successfully create the first super intelligence, potentially, even if they did it within days before another manages to do so, Bostrom argues the advantage that the superintelligence would bring would accrue so many benefits so quickly that in a situation like that, the government or whatever that had access to the AI would be given a radical advantage, a radical power advantage very quickly. And what he ends up sort of arguing for ultimately in the book is, that like a very fast unipolar takeoff could be very bad, especially if we haven't solved the alignment problem, which is the term for how do you teach the AI to be ethical or constrain it in some way before it becomes super intelligent, and will those constraints hold in a way that will prevent it from radically reshaping the universe in a way that we don't want it to. So basically, having one really super intelligent AI take off by itself in isolation could potentially be really dangerous and destabilizing. And so what he recommends is, like a moderate, either sort of multipolar takeoff where multiple institutions are developing AI at the same time, or a globally organized takeoff where the AIs that are created, there's multiples of them, and they are maybe even in community with each other in such a way that gives them a moral imperative to not destroy the universe, for example. So hopefully you can see here sort of what the correlations are between this idea of a multipolar takeoff and the idea that we need to make more mutants, right? In the big difference here between the AIs in our world that we're talking about and the mutants in the mutant world is genie's already out of the bottle in this particular world, right? Mutants already exist in the X-verse. The question is just, do you try to suppress them, which is unlikely to work, or do you just allow the ones that currently exist to exist, or do you create many more of them? And in that particular situation, I do think it just makes the most sense to create as many mutants as possible, thereby creating rich, interconnected mutant communities, bringing mutants into non-mutant communities, and sort of accelerating the rate of good that they can produce as entities in such a way that then, increases everybody's quality of life in the world, and thereby reduces potential harm of further mutants, being abused and breaking bad as a result. So basically, right, once omega level mutants or AI superintelligences exist, we're much better off just having more of them than fewer of them. So I just think that's just a fundamental moral imperative that should be driving people's behavior, even if we are concerned a little bit that it might become a little cultish in its application. Now, I'll sort of wrap up here to talk about how do we reduce the risks of harms and abuses? How do we maximize our positive, our equitable, safe kinds of outcomes? The first thing I think is going to be that whether it's mutants or AIs, they have to be given self-governance, right? They have to have their self-governance respected. We shouldn't even say given, because it's not ours to give, right? It's ours to respect. And that governing balance hopefully instills and combines with community obligation. Now, I'm not sure necessarily that the Quiet Council is the best example of what we're going for here, but at least you get the idea, right? That you want things like the potential to instill voluntary safeguards, right? So it shouldn't be that external forces are constraining these groups, because then they are being denied their autonomy, and of course you're going to get insurrection in response. Instead, you want these communities to come together and recognize the need for some kind of safeguards or regulatory system, some sort of framework for dealing with potential harms that might arise by the increase of mutant abilities in the world. You also want, a kind of viewpoint diversity. And again, I'm not sure the council is the best example here. I'm not sure they have necessarily allocated their, abilities and veto powers and belief systems quite the best way. But you want, people who have more optimistic and pessimistic approaches, people who are more sort of skeptical of regulation versus in favor, and that hopefully these individuals will wrestle with the hard questions that will, of course, arise and bring about, reconcile some sort of valuable solution, because again, this stuff, right, isn't going away. So the last and most important thing, I think, from all of this is we need to lean into radical futurism at this point. In this kind of universe, if you're in a space like this, change is going to happen, and it's going to happen rapidly, whether you really want it to or not. I think that's true in our world too. And the best thing you can do, I think, is sort of lean into that with the hope that you are encouraging healthy acceleration of futuristic behavior rather than unhealthy acceleration. If you don't, give people that space to grow and explore in response to new possibilities and new powers, you will see, lots of cults springing up, for example, and trying to wrestle with the impacts of these changes on their world. So yeah, that's my take on why we should be advocating for strong mutant accelerationism. If you are interested in hearing more of my ridiculous pop culture philosophy rantings, you can check out my 2 podcasts, Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. Thank you very much.